Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As is always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-followed and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm looking forward to today's program.
I think it's going to be fun, and as a follow-up to our last session, Charles. Before we begin, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we are identifying and simply make our discussion available to the public for those that might be interested or want to contribute constructive comments, which Charles and I very much welcome and appreciate. These sessions help me personally crystallize my macro investment themes while helping Charles with his very broad research writing efforts. Today, in part 2 of our series on the emerging era of political and social conflict, as in the last session, I will be primarily leading us through our slides, and Charles will be commenting. Anything you'd like to add on our process or today's session, Charles, before we begin?
Nope, that's the plan, and we both have a lot to say, but we'll try to cram it into our usual 30 minutes.
Exactly. We have a significant number of slides to share, maybe even too many, which I'll apologize for in advance. So I'll therefore move along very quickly, but leave you the viewer to kind of go back and look at any slides I move through too quickly. So let's just jump right in. As I said, this is part 2 of what we see to be a 3-part series. We are springboarding from our prior videos, what's holding the market up, and part 1, macro messages, which both can be found on the Gordon T. Long YouTube channel. In the second session, we're going to discuss the new weapons of financial and economic and political conflict. In part 3, the next session, will address the coming shift to non-fiat currencies as a means of future globe trade settlements and what the investment themes will be for the coming era of global conflict, what we see those themes to be. So with that, on to part 2. Today we're going to explore what we expect to be an explosion in the forms of conflict. These forms will come from financial, economic, political, and social drivers. As a consequence, we're going to see new weapons, in our opinion, employed as a result, and in response to these conflicts and drivers. The fundamental question to understand and answer is, why is this occurring? The short answer is, as we laid out in prior videos, is we have a slowing real rate of global economic growth. Countries are fighting for a slowing real growth rate while debt growth consumes more and more of a relative meager economic real growth rate. This is compounded by the degree of malinvestment into non-productive assets, levels of overconsumption, and an ever-expanding entitlement programs. This, as a consequence, highlights the falsehood, or frankly, in my opinion, the fraud perpetrated by today's entitlement state. The result is we are now seeing a breakdown in what is termed as the social contract between the electorate and the elected. Charles, comments on this?
Nope, I think that's a great summary. And when we say the social contracts breaking down, it was like we were promised implicitly that there would be equal opportunity for all, and opportunities are actually shrinking. And so more and more of the pie is going to the top of the wealth power pyramid, and there's less left at the bottom. And so that's one of the drivers of social conflict we'll discuss later.
Yeah, we've never seen inequality like this in America since the Gilded Age, and it's worse than that period, and we've never seen it to this degree globally, which we're seeing in various countries reacting to it. We see ahead an era of endless conflicts, creating a public sense of ongoing chaos and instability, resulting in financial and economic fragility. And that's going to be the result of it. And we are seeing this manifest itself in the growing and broad-based distrust of the media, fake news, politicians, institutions, etc. We're seeing a growth in anti-establishment support, growth in populist movements, and an increasing sense that democracy, frankly, is somehow ungovernable as polarization of views has increasingly become stumbling blocks towards achieving workable, governable consensus. I know, Charles, you've written on some of this. Comments on those comments?
Yeah, in terms of democracy, I think there's two issues here that are going to feed the conflict, as you say, basically into permanence, which is our system is a pay to play, right? So that the wealthy have more political influence than the non-wealthy, and so that distorts democracy to the degree that you're not even sure it can be called a democracy anymore. And then the other element is, as we start fragmenting socially, people are refusing to accept the results of democratic elections, and so democracy is under assault on a number of fronts.
Talking about pay to play, Charles, I can remember some of our very first videos we did. I think I'm going back to 2012 kind of era, and we were talking about things like the crony capitalism and how dominant it was becoming. And now it's here, and that's exactly what it's mutated into, pay to play, in a bigger and bigger way. There are certain truisms that often help in finding answers to problems. In business and markets, it is follow the money. In politics, in my opinion, it's nothing happens by coincidence. In conflict, it is always financial. We have that in front of our minds. It'll help us with answering some of the questions we have here today. We have shown this graphic many times since it was created as a roadmap after the 2008 financial crisis failed to deliver real solutions, as financial problems were papered over with a political kick the can down the road policy approach or approaches. And we've arrived, as we predicted 10 years ago, at the stage of rising global political tensions, the subject of today's sessions. Because we've failed to solve problems at each of the previous stages, we now have a very bad cocktail mix. A mix that effectively now feeds on itself and leads to conflict in the obvious forms such as currency, trade, capital, and potential broadening of military wars. The catalyst for conflicts have historically been border conflicts, as seen with the South China Sea conflict currently is just one example. Claims on the North and South Poles we're seeing. Militarization of space, northern Syria, and more. Sovereign interference such as the U.S. in Chinese Hong Kong, and likely to see with future shortages such as water, food, special rare element dependencies, etc. All of these we can see right today. Or threats, whether physical or verbal, such as currently evident in North Korea, or poorly covered actions such as U.S. rates, the U.S.'s rate of the record-shattering number of treaty breakages over the last 10 years, as I tried to highlight here, which I personally found shocking because there's just so little coverage of it. We also have the simple matter of global economic uncertainty, which further strokes the tinderbox of the various forms of conflicts. But the coming era of conflict is not just external, but as I've been trying to describe here, but also internal within many of the developed and emerging economies alike. There are many glowing examples also here. Civil war, brought on by corruption and taxation and just representation. Separation, we're seeing in Spain, Brexit, Scotland, a few years ago in French-speaking Canada as examples. Wealth gap and inequality, Charles, that you just mentioned, because of social unrest, migrations, the broad-based, whether coming from South America or coming from Northern Africa or the Middle East, left versus right polarization, populism in the forms of anti-establishment, anti-status quo, anti-government, etc. Conflict is on all dimensions today and I believe accelerating. Comments on that, Charles?
Yeah, I think that's a great list, Gordon. And I just have two quick comments. One is if we go back a couple decades ago to the Cold War era, where the world was sort of broken into three sort of blocks, which was the West, the U.S. and Europe and Japan versus the Soviet Union and its satellites, and then there was like a third world, we used to call it back in the day, of nations that were not really in each camp, but that were being um, favored or recruited by the various the two superpowers, and that structure actually dampened the kind of conflict we're talking about in two ways. One is everybody that was in one of the main camps kind of towed the line, right? Because it was like, well, we have to follow these standards and suppress internal dissent because we have this large external enemy, right? And so now we have a multipolar world where it's kind of like 3D chess, right? Where everybody's now playing off and having to contend with potential conflicts with a number of states, not just one superpower. So that's creating an opportunity, if you will, for conflicts that used to be tamped down or suppressed because there was basically two camps.
Charles, I 2 years ago now, I wrote our thesis paper here at MAD-SII was on the New World Order, and that wasn't a conspiracy paper. It was really explaining this whole shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world, and how it was going to evolve, and the kind of changes, positively and negatively, it was going to see. And as you just pointed, we didn't get into it about the conflict in that particular paper, but our whole abstraction model that we use, which is available on our site, shows you how from tipping points to themes are leading to these thesis papers that we write on an annual basis. And this year's is actually going to be on the subject we're talking about, the level of coming political conflict. Many of these internal conflicts are percolating up where weak global governance, shifting alliances, and isolationism does little, frankly, to resolve. It shows itself in the form of terrorism, refugee crisis, and political stability risk. What history tells us is that historically irresolvable sovereign conflict have been inevitable. Wars have been the final arbiter. Wars have only changed in the form they take. Primarily, technology has been the driver within the form. Wars in the modern era have become accidents or circumstances versus actually being planned more and more. First World War is a classic of that. According to a former long-term congressman, those who can recall him, and that was Dr. Ron Paul, history according to his research, and he was a very good at understanding economics, even though he was a medical doctor. But history, he said, in the last century has shown total war coincided with the century of the central bank. And what's happening, what the controls that central banking have put on, and what it falls out of, or what falls out of it. It's always financial, as we said earlier. Conflict in the form of all types of violence, that is direct, indirect, with the multiplier effect, is expensive and is estimated, as shown here, at approximating 14.1 trillion in 2018, at least according to the Global Peace Index. Government spending on military and internal security comprised approximately 3/4 of the total cost of violence in 2018. What this means is the reality is the world can simply no longer afford nor fund this level of expenditure relative to global GDP growth and GDP absolute, so it can only be viewed as, and what we're seeing with conflict, it can only be viewed as expected to get even worse going forward. How can it be, possibly be funded, or does it just bleed lack of growth even further if it starts to evolve and accelerate as we see? Now we get down to the important question, which is which will help us answer or help with part three with our investment thesis. Since we know conflict is usually financially driven and that the driver today is slowing real rate of growth, can we surmise what form the conflict will likely take and what will be the new weapons employed? Will they be hard or soft, low intensity weapons? That is, military forces as in hot wars, or technology in the form of information technology, fintech, artificial intelligence, or process disruptors. Historically, we have seen soft weapons such as embargoes, trade wars, capital controls, currency wars, leading to hard weapons, as in military wars. Today, we're already seeing soft weapons, such as, and I'm showing here a list of what I could have made it larger, but what I stopped at: sanctions, stealth cyber disruptors, co-opting, such as election interference and subversive civil unrest creation, misinformation, and a 24-hour news cycle. But we should expect new technology also, as we mentioned, to will destabilize the MAD balance. For those who remember the Cold War, that is, MAD stands for mutually assured destruction, and we've seen or been in since just after the World War II, and that's changing with super hypersonic equipment and military equipment, which is actually working right now. Alternate sovereign control of currency creation and circulation. That is, like, for example, cryptocurrencies, which is exploding, and it's just clearly going to change the form of central banking in the next numbers of years. Weaponization of, and I've seen reports on this, weather, space. We just created a space agency or Department of Defense in the United States. There's little doubt we're going to see the weaponization of space and robotics. Digital disruptors such as, the one which we are well aware of now is EMP, the electromagnetic pulse, and I can go on. These are all available on the drafting board and potential. Charles, comments on any of them, or you want to add anything to them?
Yeah, I think I'm really pleased with your organization here of the soft and hard manifestations of conflict. I just have a couple quick points. One is that historically, when rising powers challenge established powers, that's often the trigger for open warfare, right? Or heightened conflict. And so we can go back to the Greek city-states. We can go back to the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. We can go back to Germany rising in the 19th century and challenging France and Britain. All of these, the rising power versus the established power, those are flashpoints. And one of the things that should concern us is wars often break out, as you say, by happenstance, but beneath the surface, one of the causes of war or open conflict is one side overestimates their power. In other words, the established power figures they can easily take on the rising power, or the rising power thinks they can easily conquer the established power, and so that miscalculation is a pattern in history. And then I just want to add to the comments you have here about the soft conflicts are often, as you note, about resources, right? If you can control the resources and starve your competitors of those resources, then you will emerge the stronger power simply because you've starved them of the resources that they need, such as water, energy, and so on. And then the financial aspect you're talking about, I just wanted to bring up real quickly. The Cold War ended partly because the Soviet Union did not have the financial capability of selling trillions of dollars of bonds, like raising the money to fund its military. It had to pay for everything with hard cash. And when the price of oil fell, that was their basic source of hard cash. And so they simply couldn't afford the military expenditures. And so, as you say, once the expenditures start rising to these insane levels, it basically bankrupts everybody that can't borrow trillions of dollars.
And that was a clear strategy that we incorporated against Russia. That was and it went right back to 1972, the oil embargoes, and us making sure that oil would always be sold and bought and sold in U.S. dollars, as an example, as a strategy. And that's exactly what's going on here. I'm not sure that the U.S. might be on the receiving end of that problem today, but I'll leave that for another day. But just for our listeners, to show you that this is real. This isn't just a nice chatter here of the conflict. And I just took in the last 30 days headlines that I'm seeing, and there are many more, and I clipped out. And one here: China is reportedly weaponizing water and worsening droughts across Asia. In Russia, a mysterious radiological blast was reported while they were developing unparalleled weapons. My friend Greg Hunter at Watchdog USA recently interviewed a just retired three-star Air Force general that strongly hinted at U.S. technology that could, and I'll quote him, deliver a person anywhere on the planet in less than an hour. Think about that one. Changing from a technology, changing the method of warfare or the method of threatening other nation states. New forms of drones are appearing regularly. We all know that. But what about drones in submarines, ships, battlefield equipment, etc.? I read just yesterday, that Russia is now deploying drone tanks to areas of conflict in the world right now at this very moment. Hypersonic weapons are operational, which means first strike is now possible in regards to, as I mentioned earlier, MAD. We don't have a mutually assured destruction anymore if you have first strike capabilities. This changed the entire nuclear standoff that we've had in the past. That's why the breakage, as I mentioned earlier, of these treaties is so profound right now. It leaves the world in a position where something could trigger first strike, and they think they have the capability to change the whole dynamics. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying these are the threats that are going on or are looming. Reported alliance war games are becoming larger and more threatening regularly. Saber rattling no longer carries the news flows like it did only a few short years ago. It takes an IBCM rocket from North Korea over Hawaii to get our attention today, and I'm sure get your attention too, Charles, right? What was that just went by? But we need to fully recognize that the world is presently a tinderbox with, frankly, too many and, in my opinion, irresponsible sociopath politicians running around playing with matches right now. So, which weapon that is used to create the triggering threat or respond to a threat is going to be increasingly important, and your investment thesis and portfolio allocation will, in my estimation, Charles, I think you agree with me, increasingly require that it be thought through based on expanding global conflict next year, year after. And frankly, not just your investment thesis, your sanity. Yeah. Charles, any comments on anything there as we wrap up?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one sort of historical context for our entire discussion today. Is there's a number of historians, such as Peter Turchin, who have done extensive research on what creates these eras of conflict, and he characterized the basic difference between periods in which people find reasons to cooperate. And this is globally, and this is also internally within each country. That people look to other, camps within their own nation, and also other nations within their alliances, and they find some reason to find common ground, right? Then that alternates with eras where people don't no longer find reasons to cooperate. They find reasons to engage in open conflict to try to grab what they want, because cooperation doesn't seem to be solving their problems. And so the context here is, if resources start getting scarce, like water in Eurasia, like energy globally, then that's, of course, what people start wanting to either cooperate about to secure these resources they need. And if cooperation no longer works, then they're going to start engaging in conflict to try to get what they need. And so that's that. I think those are the sort of fundamental drivers we're seeing as the global population rises and people's expectations rise. Everybody wants more of everything, and there's not going to be enough of everything in the current setting, and that drives conflict within nations and within global, geopolitics.
That conflict you were describing for a moment, I thought you were talking about the U.S. political system on the day we're watching impeachment go through and how polarized the opposite each group is. And I think that's a statement in itself, and not just about fighting for assets, how polarized opinion has become, how demanding people are that things be a certain way and based on whatever their belief system is or how their belief system is formed by the media and news and etc. Whatever, as I said, going forward, you're going to have to understand conflict and what it means for your investment thesis. Because long before maybe conflict actually breaks out, the financial investments are going to be there. And that's what we're going to explore in detail in part 3. What we think those themes are going to be. I think some of them are quite evident, but some of them we found in doing our research is a lot more subtle than we originally thought, as is always the case. Of course, they come with risk. Charles, we need to wrap. Any closing comments or overviews you'd like to lay out for us?
Just that I'm looking forward to part 3 because I think what we're really saying is the coming decade is not just going to be a rehash of the past decade where kicking the can down the road kept everything kind of glued together. I think we're going to see a whole different global and economic paradigm in the decade ahead, and so we're going to have to prepare ourselves for that.
Exactly. Charles, talk to you next month, and if I don't talk to you in the interim, have a great holiday season and a happy new year.
Thank you so much, Gordon. I'll talk to you next year.
Talk to you then. Bye.